Thanks,
Thank
Stephen.
you.
So pressure's on, Chris. You're being recorded. So I'm going to introduce Chris Yoder, who's Technical Director with the Midwest Biodiversity Institute. Midwest Biodiversity Institute obviously has had a long relationship with the RSEW. They do the sort of foundational surveys that we rely on for our basin assessments and for the development and the outputs from our integrated prioritization system, which formed the basis for the watershed sections of our permits. Chris is obviously just very well known in the water, the surface water management world, with a long line of publications and very much reference publications. So he's really been at the cutting edge of developing or making science meet the policy here. And it's been a real, a very important thing to me to have had the opportunity to work with him so much. So today he's going to talk about the results from our 2019 basin assessment for the East Branch. So Chris, if I've hit all those notes, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you, Stephen.
Still waiting for your screen to come through. I see it's said it's sharing. I haven't seen it yet. There we go. Okay.
Okay, are we in full slide mode?
Yes, we are now.
Okay, good. All right, well, thank you. As Stephen said, yes, we've had a very long relationship with the work group. In fact, we're in our 16th year of working with the group. So what I'm presenting today, and I do want to acknowledge Ed Rankin, who put most of this together, and there is a report to come. It's not done yet, but I expect it probably in October. Stephen's going to have to get a chance to review it. But this is about our monitoring in the East Branch in 2019. So what we've been doing is standardized biological, chemical, and physical assessment to meet three major objectives. One, determine the extent to which the biological assemblies are impaired and following the Illinois EPA guidelines. Determine the categorical stressors and sources that are associated with those impairments, and add to the broader databases for the work group study area, and to track and understand changes through time in response to abatement actions or other influences. So those are pretty standard. We're also working in the other work groups in Northeast Illinois, the Upper Des Plaines, the North Branch, Lower DuPage, and the Lower Des Plaines. So what we're doing today goes back to the original work plan that was developed in 2006. So 2006 was our first year of bioassessment, and then we have done work every year since on a kind of a rotating basis through the different watersheds. So this is a map of the East Branch watershed with the sampling sites denoted, also the major sewage plants, sewage treatment plants. Each site is assigned a unique code that helps us keep the different pieces of data unified and then separate from each other. We're using what I call a spatial sampling design that's a mix of a geometric approach and what I call a pollution survey approach, which is really, it's different than what the state does. The state of Illinois does a very synoptic, more they might have 5 or 6 sites in the East Branch where we have 30 plus sites, about 35. So it gives you an idea of the difference. And the reason this is important is we can pick up all the different pollution gradients that occur in these rivers and streams. And it doesn't have to be a gradient emanating from point source. It can be a non-point or even a habitat related type of gradient. So the 2019 survey, as I said before, 23 main stem and 17 tributary sites, and then 2 reference sites. And we do have a network of reference sites in the outlying regions and adjacent watersheds that are intended to support all the different watershed surveys. And we sample these probably 3 a year, maybe have a network of 20 plus reference sites that we look at. And we're sampling for fish, macroinvertebrates, and QHEI. QHEI is the habitat assessment. I realize some of you may be new to this, so this is like, I feel like I'm going over it for the 16th time, so pardon me if I breeze by something, assuming all the attendees know this, and please feel free to ask a question. Fish are sampled with pulse direct current methods. With the 3-person crew, macroinvertebrates are sampled with the Illinois EPA multi-habitat sampling method. That's a 2-person crew. Water chemistry is collected at all the sites by the work group, and water column chemistry, and also sediment chemistry at fewer sites, and then the continuous monitoring at 3 locations. All the data is analyzed using the Illinois EPA indices and comparing those indices to the Illinois thresholds that they have set. And then also the chemical data is compared to either the Illinois water quality standards or the Northeast Illinois IPS thresholds that we recently developed. And I'll get to what that is in a little bit later in the presentation, if you haven't heard of that effort. So we do a stressor analysis to determine the principal causes and sources of biological impairments, and I'll be going over that as well. And we also calculate a restorability factor for impaired sites. There's also a threat and a susceptibility factor for attaining sites, but we don't have any fully attaining sites, so our focus is clearly on restorability. So what is a bioassessment? It's a systematic process to assess the aquatic resource using biological indicators. These are the primary arbiter of condition, quality, attainment, non-attainment, and then chemical and physical indicators in a supporting role. Now, biocriteria are numerical benchmarks for determining attainment of a goal expressed in the definition of aquatic life designated use in the state water quality standards. Illinois has methodological guidelines. Their benchmarks are not codified in the water quality standards, but essentially they serve a similar function because it does determine their impaired waters list. So there are reasonably available tools and criteria to assess and evaluate this for all water body types. We're dealing mainly here with wadable rivers and streams, but we can also extend this to large rivers, and other water body types are even available, like wetlands and lakes and so on. So what we're after here is to first understand the basic concepts behind what comprises the quality of a water resource. And there are these 5 factors that have been widely recognized as the key components of aquatic resource integrity: habitat, flow regime, chemical quality, energy dynamics, and biotic factors. So on the left, what we have is photos of what are really good to excellent representations of each one of these 5 factors. On the right, we have the opposite extreme, which are really poor examples or poor quality representations of each one of these 5 factors. So, and there's a gradient, obviously, from left to right, from excellent to very good quality, sliding down to poor and very poor quality. So the biota are really key in reflecting and integrating the aggregate effects of alterations to any one of these factors under all conditions. And they are a reflection of the aggregation of prior events, and in essence are a reflection of what gets left behind. So water bodies are impacted by a myriad of things that happen in urban environments. It reaches almost a zenith of complexity, a mix of things that are there all the time, like point source discharges, and event-related episodic things like heavy rainfall and runoff events. So the biota, we look at a couple of groups, invertebrate organisms. Their role in an ecosystem includes energy flow, conversion, and production. Macroinvertebrates are the longest used. We always talk about biological organism groups as assemblages. And this particular assemblage is the longest used indicator group. So there have been numerous techniques and approaches developed to collect and assess macroinvertebrates. So these are some of the what we call active methods for collecting invertebrates, and Illinois happens to use the multi-habitat method, which is accomplished by using these dip nets to collect bugs, and there's a very structured approach to mapping out the habitat and then proportionally sampling that habitat by doing what are called jabs and sweeps with these nets. And then the sample is collected and it's brought back to the lab where it's reduced. In the upper right-hand corner, this is a gridded tray, and they're randomly select grids of this little square apparatus, and you take that out and you sort the bugs from the debris until you get 300 organisms. And that's your subsample that you then identify. So the whole process takes about 16 hours to process the sample and then identify it to the lowest taxonomic resolution. So again, we're closely adhering to Illinois' methods for this. Fish are widely recognized and valued by the public. And there's a variety of techniques depending on the water body size, ranging from backpack units to raft and boat mounted methods to weightable methods and so on. And Illinois DNR, I still think they use the electric seine. It's a pretty manpower intensive method. We use pulse DC electrofishing methods that are a little more effective and require fewer people to collect an adequate sample. Habitat is evaluated was something called the Qualitative Habitat Evaluation Index. This was originally developed in Ohio in the 1980s. In fact, my co-author, Ed Rankin, is the originator. And this has been widely adopted by a lot of the states in the Midwest. Indiana, Illinois, both use it. So it includes 6 major categories of habitat. It deals with the substrate, or the bottom of the stream, the types, origin, quality, and the condition of the substrate, in-stream cover, the types and quantities of cover for aquatic organisms, channel quality, dealing with the sinuosity, development and stability of the channel, the riparian zone, the width of the riparian, the quality, and how that affects bank stability and quality, and then pool run riffle. Every stream has a pool run riffle sequence, and we're looking at things like depth, current types, substrate condition, and morphology. And then gradient is also a factor. That's the gradient is how much a stream falls per unit of distance. For the evaluation of the biological data, we use the Illinois indices, and they're both based on the original index of biotic integrity developed by Jim Carr when he, in the early 1980s, when he was at the University of Illinois. And this has been picked up on by numerous states and since that time, and they have adapted it to their own fish fauna. That's how it was intended to be used. It's comprised of metrics, for instance, like number of native fish species, number of sucker species, number of native sunfish, number of native intolerance, etc. These are all scored based on calibration that the state has done statewide and by what they call ichthyoregions. And so we have all that programmed to compute the IBI scores. You can rank the IBI scores. The total score goes from 0 to 60, and you can rank them sort of in an excellent to good to poor and very poor and very poor, fair, I should say, and then poor and very poor quality. It makes it a little bit easier to communicate condition. There's also a threshold of attainment for the general use, and that is at this value of 41. And that is what Illinois EPA uses to determine the impaired status of the water body. There's also a macroinvertebrate index, and it's also comprised of different metrics. And I also wanted to say that there is an expected response of these metrics to stress, and that the measured value here would be expected to decrease. There's other metrics where the expected response is for the value to actually increase in response to stress. So that's how they work. The general use attainment threshold here is, this is a 0 to 100 index, and this is the general use attainment threshold. So then the biology, as I said before, it's supplemented by water sampling, most of which consists of grab sampling. And during the summer, fall months. And we can also take advantage of other data as it's available from other sources, especially things like discharge loadings, whole effluent toxicity testing. And we do a summary of wastewater treatment plant loadings and flows for each survey. So we get all this data. So what do we do with it? Well, initially we were kind of forced to use what was available, and that was the Illinois water quality standards. And what we quickly found out was a lot of the parameters that are now of interest and thought to be associated with impairment, the standards either don't exist or they're outdated. And so, and we had encountered this in other states as well. So what we started to work on was something called an integrated prioritization system, IPS. And the goal of this system was to provide a framework for housing data, but also making it available for analysis, and also doing some initial analyses on it, like extracting out thresholds that corresponded to the narrative condition categories of excellent, good, fair, poor, and very poor. So to do that equitably with field data, you need to have a broad enough range of conditions so that you get a good response against the biota with the range of these stressors. And these stressors aren't just chemical, they include the habitat data and also different attributes of land use data. So all that was compiled and analyzed via this IPS process. And this is pretty much limited to Northeast Illinois, and which encompasses all the watershed groups that we're now working with. So this, what we have produced so far, and these are still in draft state, but we expect them out hopefully by the end of the year. There's the technical documentation for the IPS. So this works through all the, how we analyze the data, how we derive the thresholds for different parameters and attributes of chemical and physical data, and then also developing this restorability scheme for impaired sites and susceptibility and threat rankings for attaining sites. And what those should do is allow you to say, okay, I can use the restorability factor to evaluate the likelihood that conventional approaches to stream restoration are more likely to work. In other words, the stream has retained enough of its base attributes that it should respond favorably to a currently employed restoration practice. These susceptibility and threat scores are intended to alert us to areas of threat before excellent and good streams become impaired, so that we could also go out and evaluate those locations and say, what do we have to do to prevent these areas from falling into impairment? So the other part of this effort was to develop a visual platform for navigating the IPS, but also encouraging exploratory analysis by others. And so this was all put on a platform known as Power BI. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of it, but it's just an electronic organizing tool that's pretty powerful, and it can handle large amounts of data. And these are some of the screenshots that are currently in the current IPS dashboard. So this is intended to support multiple restoration and protection objectives and projects. It provides rankings of restorability for impairments at the site, the reach, and the subwatershed scale. And the subwatershed scale would be if you're familiar with the hydrologic unit codes, it's at the 12-digit scale. And it provides an accounting for the limiting stressors that actually add up to contribute either to the restorability or the threat susceptibility score. So there is a user manual for the Power BI dashboard. I said before, it allows the user to examine and assess data, such as use attainment status and associated causes of impairment, biological effect thresholds for assessing risk of existing and new impacts on use attainment. It's scaled to 5 narrative categories: excellent, good, fair, poor, and very poor. Restorability factors for impaired sites. I've already said these things a couple of times. One thing we need to do is to get training set up for the collective watershed groups. What we're working on right now is training for the primary watershed group coordinators, and doing the training there before we go to a broader audience. So that's kind of where this process is. And as an illustration, this table is what we used to use. It was just whatever we could amass in terms of water quality criteria, different effect thresholds available from other sources, even out of state, and then what we call non-effect benchmarks, which are reference benchmarks, and the Illinois non-standard thresholds, which really aren't related. Those aren't set by any relationship to a biological response. They're independent of that. But there were a lot of gaps in this coverage. So these have been updated via the IPS. And here's an example, like for chloride. The way this is done, I'm not going to go into too much detail or I'm going to run out of time. It was done independently for fish and invertebrates each. And it was also focused on the most sensitive taxa in each group that were responsive to that particular pollutant. So this is also independent of the indices themselves. And it's focusing just on which taxa and species really showed the best response to that particular pollutant. And then there were benchmarks expressed in how we measure these parameters. So for chloride, these are in milligrams per liter. And these are the thresholds for what corresponds to excellent biological assemblages: good, fair, fair poor, and poor very poor. And you can see here these do rank logically. The higher the chloride, the poorer the biology. Then we also calculated the reference sites values and the median and the interquartile range for that. And we did this for a number of different parameters. In fact, I think there were, when you add up the habitat and the land use into it, we've got, I think, more than 80 different variables that we have thresholds that had meaningful relationships with the biota. I know total phosphorus is one that's of great interest to some of the stakeholders due to the NARC process. And right now, this is our threshold that corresponds to the general use. A little bit different in what the state work group came up. This matches that a little more closely, the excellent threshold. So there's some things in here that I think are going to be useful, and but we need to work through it because there's going to be some sticker shock with some of these, I suppose. So we did this for nutrient and nutrient effect parameters, and then also organic enrichment. We did it for a whole host of other parameters, and so those are all in the IPS document. The the restorability, the algorithm for restorability, susceptibility, and threat. So again, as I said before here, the excellent and good sites or good condition is considered to be attaining. And so we're not assigning a restorability score because there's nothing to restore, but we are assigning susceptibility and threat scores to those so that we can react and ahead of time before these become impaired. So fair, poor, and very poor condition is impaired. It's below the general use. And again, the restorability factors right now, and this is a placeholder, these ranges, until we have a chance to actually work with these things and actually do some restoration and find out how good this scale is. We're really kind of stuck with these kind of ordinal judgments about how restorability a site is. We do know the higher the restorability score, theoretically, the more that site should respond to restoration practices. So that's the IPS, and the reason I wanted to cover that is because then we can turn around and use that in these annual assessments. So the East Branch, as you all well know, is urbanized, and the main stem is dominated by wastewater flows. So understanding the setting is always important. There are dams and control structures, some of which have been addressed. You all know the Churchill Woods Dam was modified and partially removed back in 2011. And fish passage then becomes an issue because a lot of these water bodies have been badly polluted. In fact, looking at data from the 70s and 80s, the river was clearly in very poor condition. So as water quality has improved through time, that should allow organisms to reinvade the system, so to speak. But if there's a dam precluding that, then we may, that may be hampering the level of recovery that we might see. So we know about the dams on the East Branch, but we can't control what's outside of that. And the Shanahan Dam at the mouth of the DuPage River really blocks access to the entire basin. And that's just a given. Whether anything is going to be done about that or not, there are other issues to consider, such as invasive species that are now blocked getting past that barrier. And that's an important consideration. But what we do know is that the site that we have downstream in the DuPage River has one of the highest IBI scores in the state. And above it, the IBI scores are about half of that. So that dam is definitely an effective barrier to reinvasion, especially by fish. Macroinvertebrates, not so much, because most of them are insects and they can fly. So this is a inventory of the wastewater discharges. I think the interesting thing to note here is that wastewater effluent comprises the majority of the river flow during the summer months, and it can actually exceed 100% of the background flow during low flow periods. So we always look at the hydrograph for each year. So this is looking at the 4 years of assessment that we have so far, 07, 11, 14, and 19, and looking at the flow regime. Flow regime in 07 was really low, and we haven't had a repeat of that kind of a flow year. We got a little bit into it in 2011, but 2019 was actually a higher flow year. In fact, almost all the flows are above the 75th percentile duration flow at the gauge. So the annual flow regime can affect water quality parameters and how they impact exposure and responses of aquatic life. So looking at a few select parameters, I'm going to I'm only going to look at maybe 2 or 3 of these. This is nitrate. And we always arrange these from upstream to downstream, from left to right. River mile is the number of miles above the mouth of the East Branch. So we have a longitudinal study area here that's just under 25 miles in length. And we can look at these by year. These are median values. And in 2011, we had some very high nitrate values. And a lot of that is emanating from wastewater treatment plants as a result of nitrification. The treat for ammonia tends to be a descending decline as we go downstream and we get away from the concentration of point sources in the upper half of the river. As far as IPS thresholds go, the good threshold is here at 5, and we still see a lot of values above that in what we call the fair range. And again, that's based on the relationship with the biota from the IPS analysis. So nitrate's really a reflection of point source loadings and available dilution in the main stem. Tributaries are a different story. Much lower values consistently than in the main stem. And mostly in what we call the excellent range. And it's a reflection of pretty much 0 point source loadings to those tributaries. Total phosphorus, again here, a little bit similar pattern, except we're not really, we are eclipsing the good threshold in the IPS by quite a bit. And again, it's a reflection of point source loadings and available dilution. And DO is another factor, and these are some of the summary of analysis of the continuous monitoring data, and also the very complex Illinois DO standard that we look at. It has a series of not to exceed numbers, which can vary based on what month you are in. So these would be the minimum, not to exceed. It's always kind of interesting to talk about a parameter where a low value is an exceedance, but that's what we call it. There's also weekly minimum values and weekly averages, and there's even a rolling average, and we have a program set up to analyze. You can really only judge full attainment or full compliance with the Illinois DO criteria with continuous data over the full season. Grab sample data and even short-term data on deployment are somewhat limited on that. So, we do have some bona fide exceedances of the DO criteria. The other issue to look at is the role of DO as a response indicator to the effect of nutrient enrichment, and by stimulating the algal response, which produces more DO during the daytime and uses it at night. And this is called the DL flux. We can look at that where we have continuous data over a 24-hour period, but we can also get some inferences out of just grab sample data. So particularly in 2011, we had some very high, these are actually median values over the summer. We had some very high values up here, close to 20 milligrams per liter. What's happening there is that the algal activity is pretty extreme, and it's pushing the daytime DO data higher, but at night it is, and we don't have night data here, but we know what's going on from other observations we've made elsewhere, that the DO is dropping, and it's this swing between the daytime minimum and maximum that is now being looked at as a indicator of nutrient enrichment as part of what we call a assessment. So instead of just looking at the concentration of the nutrient, we're actually looking at the effect it produces. And of course, the DL flux would be at a point where it's become harmful to aquatic life. And we're really not there yet with this process, but we're collecting data and analyzing, in fact, in all the different watershed areas to better understand that. So that's kind of the next step beyond just focusing on concentrations of nutrients to look at the actual effect it's having. Chloride is another pollutant that has been very highlighted in our experience in Northeast Illinois. I call them an emerging pollutant because I think they've been ignored for many years until recently. Of course, the work group's been very active with trying to manage chloride in their rivers and streams. But what we're seeing in the summer are the residual amounts that are left over from the doses of salt that are actually occurring during the non-summer months. And this is this particular graph is out of a Illinois study, and they just tracked the chloride concentration in the Illinois River at Peoria, and even in something as large as the Illinois, you're seeing an increasing trend of just base chloride levels, and the extremes are becoming more. And that's just a result of the chloride loading to the upper watersheds. And this is from a work group report on winter month chloride concentrations. We're not seeing anything like this during the summer. Our values are down even below this 200 level. And but it's showing the trends and over time, and hopefully we get a picture on that as BMPs are applied to manage the application of road salt. So it's a difficult issue to deal with because we're not going to stop salting roadways. So in terms of the median chloride during the summer, everything in the main stem is above the good threshold, mostly in the fair range. Does that mean it's going to impair the aquatic life? Well, it kind of depends. It could be one of these background influences, kind of part of the mosaic of semi-negative influences on aquatic life.
And Chris, I'm just interjecting to point out that once again, it's above the IPS threshold, not the state water quality standard in this case.
Right. This is an example where the current state standard, I think it's 500 milligrams per liter, is a bit outdated. And I think, Stephen has presentations on this. I don't think I'm stating anything new here.
No, you're not. And yeah, we're in concurrence with that. I just wanted to make sure everyone understood that some of these thresholds are ones we generated ourselves to give a better understanding of what's going on in some of the water quality standards. And we certainly see violations of the water quality standard in the winter, the previous graphic that you showed, but during the summer months, we see it somewhat, but it's much less frequent occurrence, thank goodness.
Yeah, US EPA has a national criterion. I think it's 230.
That's correct.
Milligrams per liter, so that would fall right along in here. And but there's also some other complicating factors with some co-varying factors. I believe sulfate and hardness can affect the toxicity of chlorides as well. As far as tributaries go, there's been some, this is watershed wide. So here the tributaries do sort of reflect the same results of the main stem, except we did have an increase through 20. We had a decline. We think this, a little bit of flow dilution is at work here, but I'd also like to think some of the management efforts are starting to show up as well. As far as the attention given to what is now called the salinization of fresh waters, you're starting to see some publications come out about the actual impacts of things like chlorides and sulfate ions on rivers and streams. And here's a very recent paper by Bob Miltner, who some of you folks know because he was involved with the first iteration of the IPS in 2009 and 10. And this is from his work in Ohio, which has a very large and long-lived database that's very amenable to producing some pretty reliable thresholds. And his thresholds are right in line with what we have for the IPS. But this is an example of parameters that just are not amenable to producing water quality criteria the same way we did for toxics based on laboratory studies. It's just the mode of effect is a bit different, and that's where we need good, strong historical data sets from the field. Shifting to habitat, again, we measure habitat with the QHEI, and we have IPS thresholds of good, fair, excellent, good, fair, poor, very poor quality habitat. My take home from this graph is that nothing much has changed over time. It's very consistent. There's a few places, maybe up at Churchill Woods, where we've seen a little bit of incremental gain in habitat quality, but pretty much the same. Some segments of poor habitat due mostly to legacy hydromodification, and a lot of fair habitat. QHEI alone doesn't explain everything, so we also developed this, what's called a QHEI matrix. So we array the site data in rows from upstream to downstream. This would be the East Branch main stem. And we have what are called good habitat attributes and modified attributes. The simple take-home message is the more good attributes we have and the fewer modified attributes we have, the better the habitat is. But this also gives us a roadmap to begin to understand what aspects of habitat need to be addressed. So this could almost become a design template for restoring habitat. And the goal would be to eliminate these modified attributes, especially the high influence ones signified by these red symbols. And if we eliminate those, we're hopefully going to develop more good attributes at the same time. We have this ratio that we look at, ratio of good, of modified to good. And if that ratio gets much above 1, we become to be concerned about the role of habitat in being able to support a desirable biota. So in the main stem, it's not terrible, but we do have definitely more of this in the upper main stem and a little bit better quality in the lower main stem. The tributaries are a different story, some really very high ratios, and that's because being smaller, they can be overwhelmed by the legacy of historical land use and stream channel manipulation. So it can get to the point where it would take a massive restoration effort to reverse this kind of ratio of 10 to 1 to be to the point where it could support general use. The macroinvertebrate IBI, and again, the thresholds for attainment of the general use, which equates with good. Very few sites have attained that, and they tend to be in the lower strict reaches of the main stem, mostly in the fair range, a few in the poor range. In 2019, everything was pretty much solidly fair. Fish IBI, sort of the same story, except maybe a little bit more into the poor
Chris,
range.
could we go back to the macroinvertebrates just for a second? I just want to make sure it's on this clear on the graphic. So once again, the green line there is just noting what we need to get to meet the general use for the macroinvertebrate category, that green dashed line. Just so everyone's aware that that is the goal, is to get those scores above that line for the entire length of the main stem. That was it.
Yeah, and it's the goal to get both groups above that line. You only have full attainment when both assemblages fully meet the general use threshold. So as far as attainment status goes, we express it in terms, it's over here clear in the right column. We express it in terms of full, partial, and non-attainment. And then for non-attainment, we further distinguish between fair and poor. That's how the state does it. So we can, my color coding is in error here, but it gives you an idea too, and then incrementally, how far away are we from attaining both indices and that type of thing. So that's just the status. So what do we do about it? So, and this is a map of the attainment status. I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but there's a tendency to the non-attainment to be poor out in the tributaries and to be non-fair in the main stem, in particular the lower main stem. So as Stephen said, the end goal is biological assemblages meet the state's aquatic life use biocriteria. So getting past just the attainment status, what's causing it? So what we're doing here is just called a synthesis table. And we go through a process where for each site, we can list the exceedances of the chemical and physical variables that are measured alongside the biology. We can also place them whether are they exceedances the very poor, or fair IPS thresholds. And the idea is that the very poor exceedances are the ones that we would want to deal with first, at least the poor and very poor. And maybe pay attention to the fair exceedances, but really focus more in on the poor and very poor as far as what we deal with. And so in the main stem, there's a few chemical BOD shows up once, nitrate shows up, but the majority of these are habitat related in dealing with either the channel condition or the substrate. And it's pretty replete throughout that most of the poor and very poor related habitat. And that's probably not news to anyone. The fair exceedances also include quite a few habitat attributes. We begin to pick up more of the, chloride, nitrate, total phosphorus, that kind of thing. Over here on the right, we also have the restorability rank. And again, the restorability, just based on the range of score here, is what we would place in the what we call the moderate or the middle category. Green here would be what we would call good restorability. And if it were blue, it would be excellent. And we really don't have any of those in the East Branch. So the prospects for restorability tend to be a little bit better in the lower part of the river. And again, the score is an adding up of all the different factors and a weighting of factors like land use and habitat that tend to be a little bit more reclusive. If you don't fix those, anything else you do with water quality is really not going to work very well. So it tries to apportion them to how limiting different factors are to the attainment of the general use. In the tributaries, we get into a few places where the restorability scores are even lower. And a lot of those is related to encroachment of urban land use and things like that. So it at least provides a way to start looking at, okay, where am I going to have the best chance to execute restoration, and what am I going to aim that restoration at? So that's where we're going with this. And again, it's something that, it's our best effort to try to figure out what's going on. So just to summarize, some observations. The DO regime continued to exhibit wide nutrient-related DL swings and water quality standards exceedances in 2019, the same as they have in the previous years. There were elevated nutrient levels in the main stem greater than the Ips threshold, and at least for nitrate, they were lower in tributaries. Elevated chlorides watershed wide. Habitat quality has been consistent. Aquatic life attainment status is uniformly non-fair and non-poor. Multiple causes that can be differentiated by severity based on the very poor, poor, and fair IPS exceedances. And restorability is moderate at most sites, good at some sites, and limited mostly by the legacy habitat modifications and land use, especially in the tributaries. So I think that's all I have to present. Hopefully you got time for a few questions.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions, you can either put it in the Q&A or the chat and we will get them to Chris, whatever is easier. I can look at both of them.
So I have a question while we're waiting for other ones to come in, Chris. So just, and actually, could we flip back to the IBI longitudinal plots?
Yeah, if I can get this to work.
I know sometimes when you pause and zoom it then, I know I was having trouble the other day that it would keep locking up. Yeah, so just if we're looking at these, we'll just look at macroinvertebrates for the moment. You can see that we're in that sort of, sort of the mean is around between the 20 and the 40. And then if we go to the FIBI, we're between mainly between the 20 and the 30. Is it too gross of a generalization to point to that that's really the effect of we'll say the Shorewood and the Shawnahan Dam on the system? Because I would just expect, and very, very generally, both these sets of organisms evolved in the same type of habitat. So, they're responding to very similar habitat variables. So there's obviously something dragging the fish down that's not dragging the insects down. And when I see this kind of imprint where we just see the fish are consistently lower than the insects, and then so that always leads me to fish passage. So would that, am I being too flippant there, or do you think that that's a fair conclusion?
Well, I think and again, the benefit of my knowledge of the other watershed areas that we've worked on in Northeast Illinois, I think it is fair to say that the macroinvertebrates have outperformed the fish in some places, and in some places by quite a bit. And seeing that most of the sources of pollution have been controlled, most of the wastewater plants are, being limited on what we call a water quality basis. You would expect more recovery to have happened in that time period. So we've always thought that the fish lagging the bugs was a result of the inability of fish to reinvade these upper watersheds. And in the DuPage, I think if you look at the results of the Channahon Dam, you look at the results downstream, you have an IBI of 60.
Yes.
That's like, I counted up that's the max score of the index. So
yes.
you're elevating this site here, the best IBI in the East Branch main stem, which is probably about a 37 or something, all the way up here. I'm not saying that would happen if we removed the Channahon Dam, but
clearly some of those
like
species,
that is a factor. And it's something we've looked at for a number of years. So what's the solution to that? And I think there's going to be a lot of reluctance to do anything with fish passage at Channahon because that's right adjacent to the invasion front of Asian carp.
Yeah, the silver and the big head carp.
And so how are you going to get fish around that? Are we going to maybe have to do some stocking, experimental, to see if we can get some of the missing species established, which will elevate the IBI score?
Yeah, I think that's your logic is correct. So we have approached IDNR about stocking off, perhaps doing a capture in the lower page, and perhaps working with in the Des Plaines River, and then perhaps working with the Urban Stream Research Center. Or there was another organization, actually Nuclear Power Industry, was also looking at stocking off native fish. And then if we could do this, we were looking at this for the Faywell Dam and for obviously getting around the Channahon Dam, but IDNR did not have any appetite for it at that time. And they said, talk to us again in 5 years. And of course, what they're worried about is setting some sort of precedent in terms of, even with fish stocking, about getting some of those undesirables through. And what they were not so much worried about our program, but they were worried about setting some sort of precedent for some of the other projects that they were looking at. So we were kind of caught up in the political wake of some other larger items going on. But it was a pretty firm no at that point, even though I know some of the folks at IDNR were pushing pretty hard in our favor. But maybe it's the time to go back and start talking to them about that. So my other question was, could we go and look at the phosphorus plot? Yeah, it wasn't up on the screen for a lot of times. So I want to make sure folks got a good look at it. But yeah, that once again, the thing that really strikes me about this is just how consistent phosphorus concentrations, are. Even with weather variables, they don't seem to really bounce around a lot year after year. It does seem like to produce a very consistent pattern.
Yeah, especially in the upper half of the main stem. I think the lower main stem, we got some interesting variations here between sites that are somewhat consistent. And it's hard to read this because the sites are so close together.
Yeah.
In this portrayal, but there's an overall decline downstream, but we're still above the good threshold. And does that guarantee that impairment? I don't know. But they're actually, the relationship in the IPS for that threshold of the phosphorus sensitive fish and bugs is one of the tightest relationships out of all the parameters.
Yeah.
And so, is it coincidental? Is it causal? Yeah, it's phosphorus drags a lot of things along with it. It can be a marker for other things that get discharged to the water. So that's why looking at I like looking at the nutrient effect indicators more than just looking at concentration.
Okay.
If you look at this, I mean, somebody's going to say, yeah, you need to do a mass balance against 0.277, and that's your effluent. Yeah.
So Chris, just thinking on the report, one of the things we may like there is to have this particular graphic perhaps broken up a little bit. Like this graphic, fine, but then perhaps having it in 3 stages so we can perhaps see some of those details, particularly in the lower sections where it gets a little crowded. Okay, so then my last point was on chlorides. So we were showing that chloride plot about the main stem and then versus the tributaries. Yeah, so one of the other interesting variables here is time in these. What we're doing here, and Chris, this is not so much for you, but everyone watching, is that we start collecting these in May, June, and then we go all the way through to August, September. And then what we do is we collapse those in time into this median value, so it's spatially collapsed into this single point. But if you instead take this data and ignore the spatial component to it, but rather put it on a temporal plot where we look at the data when the data was collected, what you'll get to see is that this data trails away. In other words, as we move from the earliest sample time to the latest sample time. So we get this tailing off, and what you get then is the lowest value is obviously in September, October. This is what we'd expect to find in that, but that just clearly shows that it's winter chlorides that is driving this. And then by October, November, we're kind of hitting the floor that's set by the concentration from wastewater treatment facilities. And if you look at the tributaries, you'll see that you get that same tail off. But it actually gets it tails off less rapidly, but it gets it falls further, if you know what I mean. So it's less precipitative drop off during the summer, but it falls away to a lower concentration, and that's because we're getting dilution from the treatment plants in the main stem, but also they set a floor as we get into those that fall period, and that floor doesn't exist in the tributary. So it's kind of an interesting, I always find it very interesting the way you guys, something I learned from you guys was about really pulling those tributaries in the main stem out, and you can learn a lot about the dynamics of the watershed from comparing between those two things. So I guess that was more of a couple of statements than a question. See if we have any, not seeing any questions coming in. So I guess one of the other things is that we are currently engaged in pulling together a restoration project for that lower section of the river, which the IPS identified as being the most restorable section. And it will be targeting, see, we had problems with sinuosity, substrate, general QHEI in there, but it shouldn't be ignored. There were also chemical variables, noticeably chloride, which were in there, which are also going to have to be dealt with. You were talking about using that table of the good and modified attributes as a kind of a template for guiding that process.
Yeah, that's the using the Qhei matrix to identify what aspects of habitat are really deficient at each site and along a reach. There is a, what I want to say, there is a watershed and reach component to habitat that also is at work. And one thing it's difficult to show, sorry. One thing it's difficult to show is that one of the variables that came out of one of our IPS analyses was the average HUC 12 QHEI score. It was very strongly related to the overall, to the biological quality and also to restorability. So there's site-specific habitat, and then there's also reach and watershed scale habitat that needs to be paid attention to. So if you're going to take on a project to fix habitat, you know, focus on a reach, not just a site.
A particular site, yeah.
But
and definitely scale is doing a lot of thinking about how to use scale and at what scale sort of is there. There's no, I don't think there's any maximum scale limit. In other words, if you go above this size of project, that it's less effective. Of course, the limiters there are the landowners, you know, they're practical ones, land ownership, funding and such, but there does definitely appear to be a minimum scale that if you go beneath, you're fighting sort of the you know, against that sort of size gradient.
So a HUC 12 watershed is going to be about 30 square miles drainage area. Now, I don't know how many HUC 12s there are in the East Branch, but you know, it's a manageable area, but it also, you know, if you elevated that up and said, well, let's go for an average, you know, HUC 10 or HUC 8, it'll become meaningless because you're just averaging it over too wide of an area.
Yes. Yeah.
And you're absolutely missing hotspots. I mean, it's kind of same analogy applies to monitoring that's too broad scale. It's pretty good at getting the average, but it misses a lot, misses high and low end.
Yeah, a lot of the
things that
variability
are out there. So yeah, this can be used as a template to, you know, focus in. So here, you know, especially where we have a channelized or no recovery situation. I mean, obviously the stream channel is going to have to be dealt with, and that's going to drag along. If you address that, it's not just going to eliminate this attribute, it's going to eliminate these other attributes as well.
Yeah.
These other bad attributes.
Yeah, some of these can be from a restoration point of view or lumped into the same activity. Yeah.
Right. And it's going to add to these good attributes. That's going to result in the QHEI score going up. And unless there's other things that are precluding the biology should respond to it.
Okay.
And the only problem you're facing in places like these branches are just such a complex mosaic of stressors that, you know, peeling off these layers is going to be a, you know, an exercise that needs to be watched. And
yeah,
but
that's not the only
you know,
problem, but understood.
Based on our experience in other places like at Oak Meadows and Salt Creek, we are able to eke out some incremental improvements in the biology that are, they're stopping short of full attainment of general use, but they do show that things are headed in the right direction.
Yeah, and they do show that we can, the system does respond to management changes, management inputs, which is an encouraging thought. Okay, so I do have a question about the presentation. Yeah, the presentation will be made available on the DRSCW website. I also have it recorded. I know that some folks at IEPA had asked about getting a recording of this, so we'll make those both available. The folks who've asked it to be recorded, we'll get them a link, and the PDF of this will be on the website. Chris,
Yeah,
I think
and
that's all. Sorry,
The
Tina.
DRSCW does have a YouTube channel, and most of our meeting presentations are on that, so you could go find it there as well.
All right. Well, with that, Chris, thank you very much for taking the time with us this morning.
No, thank you.
If you want to hang around for the rest of the meeting, you're more than welcome, but we won't be hurt if you've got you got other things to jump into.
Okay. I'll see what happens here.
All right. So
I'm
you can
closer to lunch than you are.
Okay. So I think, are you still sharing or?
No, we are back to
Okay.
normal screen.
I stopped.
All right.
sharing.
Okay. Well, with that, and I am going to move into the business part of our meeting. Try to get everybody out by 11. Okay, so permit negotiations. Those are proceeding with IPA. So this is the set of permits which will take our POTW members through to approximately 2025, 2026. We have some members who or want to continue with the special conditions. So we have, or a new set of special conditions rather. We've negotiated that with our environmental partners and with IEPA, US EPA. We have a permit out there which will allow them to do that. We have others that have opted to stay on the original special conditions. So moving into 1 milligram per liter at the 25, 26 timeline. We have a permit out there for them to do that. And then we have other ones that are already at 1 and want to stay at that place until we get the nutrient implementation plan out in 2023, which will then set the long-term management for phosphorus into the future. Couple of other things came up in this permit. We were originally just negotiating phosphorus with IEPA, but there were a couple of other changes to the permit, notably total chlorine residual and more complexly fecal coliform. So we have been working with both members and IEPA to try to get this sorted out. This was a from the 2019 TMDL, but since that that data was put into that model, some of the flow regime at some of the treatment plants have changed. The loadings coming out of that study were also being picked inconsistently out of the table, so everyone was ending up, well, most folks had a mix of what those values were, and we've been working with IEPA and our members to try to get the right numbers into everybody's permit and make sure that nobody is ending up being shortchanged on their loading allocation. There's also some items going in there with CSOs that still need some attention. We also have some language in the condition that we negotiated with IEPA that we're still working on. These are relative to when the condition comes into force for phosphorus and also the phosphorus discharge optimization planning at treatment plants. And we're working with IEPA on those. Just want to point out again, IEPA permit staff, they're really got a lot of things going on. I've got, it's a small, very skeleton staff that they're operating with, and they've been just first class to work with on all of this. We're also producing permits for each of those iterations for the lower DuPage. So the last item there, I'll jump to the final bullet in that section, which is for MWRD. We have a draft agreement with MWRD for how we're going to move forward with them helping implement our project. Probably this will be the Fullersburg Woods project. And that still, I think the staff and board that were working on that are pretty happy with where that agreement is, and it will go to the board for final approval, also to the MWRD board, obviously, for final approval. All right, moving into physical projects, number 4. So Oak Meadows project, once again, we just did carrying out the 2021 bioassessment there, which will include Oak Meadows. I'm going to hand over to Dina to talk about Faywell Dam project.
Faywell, that's you.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. Yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. The F's, I'm not the only person who's got confused by the both beginning with F. Sorry, Faywell Dam.
I'll do the other F dam.
I actually ran that through in my head and didn't catch it. So we have submitted a updated plan to DuPage County Stormwater for review. Obviously, we're asking to have a structure placed into one of the culverts at Faywell Dam. And this would be a 2x3 stainless steel structure, which should allow fish, the fish that we've identified, to be able to push their way up into the watershed above the dam. The county obviously are going to have concerns about debris getting snagged up on that, how it affects upstream and downstream water elevations, and of course how it affects any gate operations. But in terms of this project, this is the minimal footprint that we can do on the project in terms of not having any other repercussions for any the operation, etc. off the dam. So that's currently under review by them, and if they are happy with it, what we'll move forward then is submitting for permitting approval to IDNR and to county. We're also started developing an MOU in preview that the county will give it a thumbs up, and the MOU will cover how this structure will be managed between ourselves, county, and the Forest Preserve. The Forest Preserve own, like the DuPage County Stormwater owns the dam, and the Forest Preserve owns the land around the dam and access to it. So all those partners will have a memorandum of understanding to make sure we give this the best possible route forward, and hope that if the structure works as advertised or as we predict, that then we can keep it operating into the future. Things with fish passage like this is it's not just a one-off. It's like a dam removal. You get that structure out of the way and fish can just move through it. This structure would have to operate into the future in order to maintain fish passage into the upper parts of the watershed. Last item there is the new permits do push this project for completion back into December of next year. All right then, Dina, I'm at Growy Mill now.
Yes, so Floresburg Woods / Growy Mill.
Yeah, that's
too many F dams in our
really
watershed. Hold on 1 second.